back on LinkedIn and YouTube, and we're here to talk with Jim Power about how to transition from law enforcement to corporate security. Interesting thing about Jim, you've been in corporate security your whole life, or your whole professional life, and you didn't transition from law enforcement. So why am I talking to you is because, first of all, we're buddies, and we're in ASIS together, and we're on the same...
Slow news day.
Yes, but we're on the same investigations council together, and you're passionate about what we do in ASIS. You're passionate about what we do in our industry, and you do see that there are some skills gaps with our partners in law enforcement. You worked in the financial services industry, and now you work in pharmaceuticals. So you deal with a lot of law enforcement folks who are going to end up making a transition into either financial services or the pharmaceuticals. So I know I usually start off with, what helped you, what hurt you in your transition. I won't start out there, but let's just talk about you're a senior leader in the private sector. What kind of skills do you see? What kind of resumes are you seeing coming out from law enforcement, and how is that going to help your industry or your organization? And then what kind of skills gaps do we need to start filling as well?
I think it's interesting because your question regarding the resumes, I see tons and tons of resumes, although they're very hard to differentiate. A lot of law enforcement folks coming into the private sector want to highlight every training class they ever took, every certification, every commendation, I would recommend grouping some of those things to make it something that stands out on the whole, rather than the number of cases, the number of trainings. If you're going into an industry and you're going to apply for a pharma job, a finance job, whatever in the private sector, whether you were a marksman or received a commendation, probably isn't something that you want to look at. The things that are pertaining to the job you want, and I think that would actually sift you to the top of the pile.
That's a great point. We do appreciate that there are a lot of SWAT operators out there, but that doesn't necessarily translate to the financial services industry when you're looking for an investigator, and I'm sure you've hired investigators.
I have.
So we talk about skills. We talk a lot about the soft skills as being really important. And you were telling me a story about before we started recording about data analytics and how important that is. So as a skill, that's not necessarily something, unless you come out of being a fraud detective and a law enforcement agency, you're an intel analyst, you don't necessarily use analytics, and maybe they use it in crime reporting, things like that. But you use and have used data analytics in kind of an interesting way. I don't know if you want to share a little bit more about that, obviously with no attribution, but I think it highlights the importance of having those technical skills.
Yeah, and they're not to be, all those skills, again, getting back to earlier real quick, nothing against the people that were SWAT operators. We appreciate the good work that they do. In regards to the data analytics, people get worked up about that. We talked earlier about big data versus small data and the data you actually own and protect and have. People get caught up in big data. It's intimidating. You need big, but a lot of the data analytics that we talked about is data that we had at our fingertips every day. When you log into your computer, you use your login to get into your network. You did it in the police force, you did it in the military probably, but even here, everyone is unique, right? That's how you know who's doing what. We took that type of an approach. We said, what data do we own? What's unique, and what can we follow? And we actually took, in the simplest form, we just took login information, compared that to our information protection files, or our information files, so our customer base, and said, who touched what? And from that, it was astounding, the information that we learned, not only from a fraud perspective, but from a performance perspective. You can tell who's doing the work and who's not. One of the big questions we asked in that data was, who touched a customer record and didn't do anything? And if that's the case, why would you do that? So then we pulled out, we realized that there was a number of different customer records that you touched because, hey, what's my balance? Do I still have my old address on it? Whatever it was. But when you don't do that, those are few and far between. When you see one individual or two individuals that touch hundreds of records and don't do anything, that's a question you got to ask yourself. And why do they do that? And how's that compare to their peers, right? So, but to your good point, though, it's really the data that don't make it intimidating. Take what you have. Learn the systems you have.
And then using that for a little bit different goal, because we talked about, sometimes in resumes you'll see like, oh, I've made X amount of arrests, or that might, knowing the amount of arrests that somebody has in the public sector might be really important. But in the private sector, not so much. We don't have to attribute everything to criminality. That's not our ultimate goal. To your point, just knowing how many people logged on their computer every day or came to work every day and touched their badge on the badge reader to come into the office is analytics that we're talking about even.
Yeah, for sure. Well, again, and the other thing is that when you're transitioning to the private sector, all the things that were important probably to your chief or your commanding officer don't necessarily relate. And you just touched on a really good one. How many arrests did I have? In the private sector, especially in a fraud or an investigation or a security group, arrests turn into public records. Public records often hit the newspapers. Newspapers report these things. If you think it's good news, it's probably not reputationally good, because it makes your customer base go, wait, do they have a problem there? This is the fourth arrest that person's had, or whatever. And I told you earlier today, our CEO said, I don't care how many arrests you make. Get me my money back, protect my business, protect my customers, and make sure I'm not in the newspapers. And that's something that when people are transitioning in, sometimes it's very difficult to leave justice behind rather than the business form of it. And I don't mean that you don't want to do the right thing. Of course, you always want to do the right thing and bring your integrity to the job. But at the same time, that might not be how to get the money back. I don't necessarily care if so-and-so goes to jail. I want to get the asset back. I want to protect it, make sure it doesn't happen again, and make sure that whatever gap was created or that we acknowledge that we closed. And that's where we bring the real value.
And the good thing is they're using the same skills as an investigator when they're working on the street or they're working for their municipality that they would in the private sector. Goals are a little bit different. And I think you nailed it. I always talked about we identify gaps in process, and then we work cross-functionally in our organization to close those gaps. And that might be a skill that maybe they're just less familiar with. It's kind of like community service or community policing. That there's a gang problem in a certain part of your neighborhood you patrol. You could go out there and arrest every gang member you come across, but is that really going to make the change? It's kind of similar in the private sector. That there's gaps in your processes that allowed fraud to occur, let's say. But as an investigator, you didn't just go, hey, look at those gaps over there. Those are bad. You better close those. I think there's an expectation, at least on the tech side, in the tech world, there was an expectation that we would then go and be those kind of subject matter experts in that gap and why that gap occurred. And I would imagine it's the same thing in the financial services sector, but I'll let you tell me.
Yeah, for absolutely. And one of the things that I thought add value from what we did in my banking life is that we drove everything from a procedure perspective. So even if you were asked to investigate a counterfeit check, we would come back and say, where did it come from? And where did the paper come from when it was processed? Was there procedures that were not followed? Was there a procedure that didn't exist that caused this to happen? And at the end of every one of our investigations, we wrote an audit report and said, this is what we thought the cause was. These either were not followed and that caused the crime or the loss or the impact, or these didn't exist and this is a gap we need to close. How do we do that? And that brings value of the security group back to the relevancy of the business line. Because every day, as security, they say, well, you're an expense. That's right. How do you prove it? So we concentrated on closing those gaps, making recoveries, and making sure that the people that we could identify internally, externally, however, didn't come back. They didn't want to come back to our house. Send them somewhere else. So some of them went to jail. Some of them didn't.
But either way, they're not your problem anymore. And I think that's what's really important to note here is like, an organization, most private organizations don't exist to put people in jail. Your organizations that you've been a part of truly want to help their customers and protect their bottom line and protect their brand, protect their assets. And so I think there's some reach there. But I mean, we're talking specifically, where there are gaps in process and identifying these frauds and closing the gaps. with fraud investigations, but it doesn't have to be. I think it's important to note it doesn't have to only be fraud. I've done the same thing with human resources investigations. Why did you hire somebody who ended up being an insider threat, or why did you allow somebody to do something that nobody else was allowed to do, or whatever it is? And we can identify gaps that allow
Absolutely.
just bad things to happen. It doesn't have to necessarily be fraud, but I'm sure you've seen that quite a bit in your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And not only in the human resources process or, anything from shipping. A lot of the crimes or the losses we experienced were not a criminal. It was a lapse in the process. But as you investigate those losses, you identify that, maybe in the shipping context, we didn't capture the right information, or we added a step, or something was left unattended. Or, those are the types of things that I think you're referring to, and you're absolutely right.
Sure.
It can apply anywhere.
Investigations that empower and enable and that actually do benefit the bottom line because you're reducing loss. And I think those are better terms, reduction of loss or loss control than, some of the more edgy terms like corporate investigations, internal investigations, things like that. You still need those, but I think the real value from an investigation standpoint is we're going to show you, if you'll listen to an investigator or an investigations team, we're going to show you where your risks are across your whole enterprise. Mm-hmm. And when you identify those risks, and this is what I want our law enforcement partners to really understand, is that's what we exist to do. And it's really hard to put a number on a lot of those things, this kind of risk reduction or risk identification. But we empower people with information so they can make a decision what to do and how to operate, to your point about, whether it be shipping or receiving or accounts payable, or, I was even involved in contract disputes and I helped write some of the kind of the baseline policies around some of the contracts that we were writing when I was at NVIDIA. One of my contributions, which is a really low-level contribution, by the way, but it was an audit clause. Very simple. Why don't we have an audit clause in our contracts that we're making with all these vendors or our partners? And because, by the way, they're auditing us. They want to audit us. We were a vendor for some bigger technology companies, and they would just show up randomly. Their security team would come up and be like, "We're going to do a security audit of where you're keeping our hardware." And we were like, "Holy cow! Why don't we do that to our vendors? We should."
You might have started something, Scott, because we have that in every one of our contracts.
That's it. I definitely didn't start it. I probably stole it from somebody.
I tipped the hat to you. I'll give you all the credit.
Thank you, Jim. I'm here for you, Jim.
You said something about, which I thought was in your description of the terms that kind of sprang a leak here in my brain. It was specific to, you get to corporate investigations and some of the larger scale impact type things, but they're really expensive. Yeah. And people think whether you're in-house or whether you're contracted, they're really expensive. And one of the things for our law enforcement guys and gals is that, when you come to the private section, sometimes it's hard to leave law enforcement behind. Yeah. And I don't mean that as part of your persona, but as your day-to-day operations. And we spoke earlier about, I have officers, former troopers, officers, whatever, that I've hired that they can't let go of that one case. That one case may be in value or net worth, net loss to the company might be $1,000. But if you keep it on your record, I just need this one more thing, and when you get 500 cases a month, I don't care about that $1,000 if it's been written off. However, I do recommend that in your organizations you join, you make sure you capture that data, because that data is huge. Going back to the analytics piece as well.
We talk about ROI in law enforcement as being your report of investigation, but it means something different in the private sector. It means return on investment. So to your point, if you're going to spend, 100 or dozens of man hours on $1,000 fraud, are you getting a good return on your investment? And, to highlight something that we were talking about before we started recording too, is, you were talking about, don't dismiss that data. That's good data still. Yes, you might not be able to solve it right away or solve it within a reasonable period of time. Put those time limits, left and right time limits, but keep that data, because it's still data, and data is really, really important. And it may help you solve something further down the road, which I think is the story that you're telling.
And data's cheap now. Data used to be really
totally.
Data is very cheap now, so you keep that. When we had losses, we talked about how they were, what positions were involved in levels of the organization. We talked about how the loss occurred. We talked about where it occurred, what time of day it occurred, what shift it occurred on. We captured all that data. And lo and behold, when you start aggregating this stuff, patterns evolve. And
That's
it
it.
makes you go, things that make you go, maybe I should
Yeah,
go
that's
back and
right.
take a look at that.
Yeah,
So,
patterns are really, really important, and that's why I think if folks who are coming out of law enforcement can do anything, especially if they're interested in going into investigations in a corporate setting, if they can do anything at all, understanding data analytics or understanding, maybe how to code in Python or there's a whole bunch of analytical tools out there that I'm a big fan of them getting those skills or having those opportunities. So when they come to the private sector, they can speak intelligently about it.
for sure. It's interesting you say that, because when we first started doing all of this data aggregation, one of the things that was intimidating was who can code? How do they code? What do we write? And I said, all right, you know what? Let's dumb it down as much as we can. And what we'll say is that just master Microsoft,
Yeah,
Access, Excel,
access.
those database aggregators that you can go back and you can splice and dice and move that data any way you want. When you especially in Access, that was basically what our analytics were based on, because we wanted to keep it as rudimentary as we possibly could.
Dump the information in there and then just query it
Yeah, just
and learn. Yeah.
and no silly questions. Ask anyone you want, because it takes about a second in Access and you see the data.
That's great and really important to highlight as a kind of a missing skill. Unless our folks are coming out of like intelligence analyst type roles, they probably don't really have that understanding. But if you're going to be even if you're a leader, though, I think you need to know that data is important to your organization, and how you use it could make or break your budget. It can help you expand your budget. It could help you and could, more importantly, contract your budget or be more provide more value to your organization.
But they always want to know how you're using your budget, right? And there's a
Yeah.
description to run right with it. So
Yeah. One thing that we were talking about before we started recording was you went from the financial services world into the pharmaceutical world, and I thought that would be, financial services would be much more regulated than the pharmaceutical world. But talk about that. You went from security leader in financial services to security leader in pharmaceuticals. What can people pull out of that? Those lessons that you've so importantly learned.
Apologize, that's thunder in the background here.
No
We're getting
worries.
on it in Philly. No, it's funny you said it, because everybody that I meet asks me that I've been doing this. This is my 30th year in security, right? So how did you go from 24 of them in financial and now the last 6 going on 7 in pharma? And I jokingly say I really have the same job. I talk about the only real difference. I mean, instead, what I protect now is product information, people, buildings. It sounds familiar, right? With my last job, but it's the pharma pieces, supply chain, things like that. But with all of those changes and the additional information, like the supply chain, is tons of different regulatory impacts that we can be audited and inspected by pretty much every regulatory agency in the government. It seems we go from the FDA, which is an obvious one with being a pharmaceutical company, but to the FAA for shipments in the air. We ship on the oceans, so we get the Coast Guard involved. It's been interesting for me and a heck of a learning curve to realize that anybody that's ever wore a federal hat in any way probably can come look under our covers. So,
and that's important for people, especially those coming out of federal law enforcement. They don't necessarily understand how well their job translates. We were talking about CTPAT earlier, Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, which, it's probably, 15 years old or so. But I inherited that role when I was at NVIDIA, and they were like, well, you're a Homeland Security guy, so you must know about CTPAT. I had never heard of CTPAT. Now, when I dug into it, I totally understood it. It made sense to me. But I wasn't in a legacy customs role when I was a federal agent. So while I could understand it, it wasn't something I was familiar with from the regulatory side of federal law enforcement. But I think that's what's important to highlight is that there is value if you're coming out of federal law enforcement. You've done some of this regulatory stuff. Look for those opportunities, especially if you've been at DEA or another FDA or something like that. Does pharma, do you recommend that? Is pharma something that they should be looking at as an industry?
I think that all of that translates everything you just described. So not necessarily pharma in and of itself, but there's definitely roles in pharma, especially if you look at from a protection agency. A lot of what pharma deals with is obviously clinical trial data, and all those are a lot smaller companies that specialize in that data and how to protect it and things like that. So I'm sure there's opportunities there as well.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is that when you start talking about this translation into this is the fact that everything you did, one of the things that I always think is it's almost the honeymoon period, right? The new guy everybody listens to, but once you've been there a while, people don't want to listen to you. But from a law enforcement perspective, our brothers and sisters in law enforcement bring to the job a practicality, a logical and I think don't lose that, right? Like sometimes people always want to look for something elaborate, and sometimes it's just right in front of your face, especially with some of these systems things. And that practicality that law enforcement brings, I think, is absolutely a value that translates.
That is interesting. I think you're right. We talk about keeping it simple and things like that is so ingrained into everything that we do. And I always thought that was because one of two things. One, we didn't have the money to afford to be more elaborate, or two, that we were in such a crisis that there was no time to try and learn some new skill. And so we were always on the defensive, not the offensive, which is something that we talked about earlier. Having a complete defensive or a respond type mindset is not necessarily what we're looking for in the private sector.
Not at all. Yeah, I mean, if you look and the simple example that comes to mind is hostile intruder or active shooter. You definitely don't want to be responsive. You want to get in front of that one as much as you can, from warning signs, impacts to your HR standards, things like that, and make sure that you have something in place that allows people to talk to people, right? That they're having trouble. But it's interesting when you get into that response mode. You're great in that situation, but those situations don't always arise. In the private industry, you have to build your relevance to the organization all the time.
That's
especially like peacetime, right? If you want to look at it that way,
you
still have to be relevant, right?
Yeah. Not everything is a crisis that we run into, and so let me ask you this. I didn't really front load you with this question, but it's fascinating for me to talk about kind of the future of the workplace and future threats and future risk. We talk about intruders or some people with hostile intent, coming to our organizations or our events and things like that. How do you think that's going to evolve in the kind of the near term, 2 to 3 year future, with our workplace maybe not going back fully, and maybe we'll be in some hybrid type thing? What are you looking at? What are you preparing for?
Well, I think we're definitely preparing. The things that come to mind from my perspective are, I don't think we're ever going to go back to work the way we normally did. So, and before that, we went into, we were working in these open work environments, right? Common seating, less barriers, not places to hide, or, things like that. And that caused some angst, if you will, in the workplace. But now we have to look at, what does the law provide for us to provide? You're sitting in your home office, right, today. So am I. So what if in my actions at work, I have an angry employee that comes looking for me here?
That's right.
What is our responsibility?
What's the obligation to protect you in your home?
Right. Correct. Yeah. Correct. And there are small examples. I'm not an expert in the field by any means, but from a legal perspective, I'm sure there are examples out there. But that's something that I think is going to be on the horizon. That's something. I think you put it in your ticker. You make sure you at least understand kind of what that looks like and what's the framework for what our obligations are from a security perspective.
Yeah, home office safety, I think, kind of in general is something that is fascinating, because we talk about OSHA and duty to protect and things like that, and how that extends, kind of around the world, really, if you're a U.S. company. And but I think the home front or the home office is a brand new challenge. I mean, my daughter works in online schooling right now while she's in grad school, and they talk to these instructors about you might see child abuse happening, or some type of or spousal abuse occurring, but it's online, it's remote. There's nothing you can physically do to intervene at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And while having the information might be empowering, it's kind of a helpless feeling that we all have, is like, how do I help you at home by yourself? And
Yeah.
I think a lot of times, maybe before the pandemic, our response would have been, oh, we'll just put a security guard out in front of your house, undercover, sit in the car kind of a thing. And I don't know that that's the right answer in 2021 and beyond.
Yeah, I agree.
Got to be
And
creative.
we're gonna explore that for sure, whether we want to or not. The
Yeah.
other thing too is it's just not even physical protection, but your home office with your network applications and things like
Yeah.
that. What does your home Wi-Fi do? Do or not do that it should? And
Yeah.
what's the requirements of the company to make sure that it's active like that, or find a new place for you to home office?
That's it.
So, but
VPNs, endpoint
yeah,
protection. Yeah.
yeah,
These are all in our vocabulary now.
for sure, for sure.
So I'll give you the last word. What is one piece of advice that you would give somebody who's getting ready to transition or thinking about transitioning from a law enforcement capacity into the private sector? What's something that you would tell them to be aware of, to be sensitive to be ready for?
I think it's going to sound a bit contradictory at first here, but I talked about bringing your practicality and keeping that. But at the same time, you need to have an open mind that it's a new world. It's what you've been doing for the last 15, 20, 25 years in your career. It's going to be very different in what you're entering, and be open to that. Be open to not know, and be okay not knowing. Ask the questions. Nothing gets me more excited than somebody that walks in there and is willing to ask the questions, as opposed to people who nod your head and then go out and do it wrong. So
Yeah.
I would say keep that open mind, and people know you don't know, but remember, you're bringing a skill set that they're not aware of either.
Great point. Being humble and being open, being vulnerable are all really important points. Well, Jim, really appreciate you being on here. Appreciate you being willing to come and share your experiences and share how we all are trying to help our partners in law enforcement. And for the folks following along, make sure you connect with Jim. He's on LinkedIn. He'll be in the comment section below, or I'll link him on the video. And make sure you're sharing this with your partners. The most important thing that I always try to impart with our partners coming out of law enforcement is that don't go it alone. There's plenty of folks out here who do care about you and want to make you successful in your transition. So keep following this, like it, subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube, and we're going to have more of these episodes coming up in the future, and we want you to be ready for these future risks and these future challenges as well. So, Jim, I really appreciate you sharing all that information with us, and thanks, and you be safe.
Yeah, it was my absolute pleasure. Thank you, and good luck to everybody.
Yep, thanks.
Thanks.